The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped in glass, and Natalie Hayes moved through Sacred Heart's emergency department with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd triaged casualties under mortar fire, though no one here knew that. Officially, her military records didn't exist. 20 years ago, after testifying against a trafficking network embedded in military contracting, she'd been placed in witness protection, her name erased from every database, her service record sealed behind classified federal walls. Now she was just another nurse pushing a med cart down a corridor that smelled of antiseptic and old coffee, her scrubs 2 sizes too large, her voice barely above a whisper when she spoke to the attending physicians. The scar on her left forearm caught the fluorescent light as she reached for a supply, a shrapnel pattern she told people came from a car accident in 2003. Only the shape of it told the truth. Only someone who'd held a suture under fire would recognize it. It was 3:13 a.m. on a Tuesday. The night shift at Sacred Heart moved with the skeleton crew efficiency of hospitals everywhere, 2 nurses covering 12 beds, 1 resident who looked 22, 1 attending who was counting the hours until his morning coffee. Natalie had worked nights for 17 years, ever since her son Ethan was born, keeping her schedule opposite his school day, keeping her invisible. Nights were safer. Fewer questions. Fewer people who looked too closely. She folded gauze in the supply room, her movements precise and economical, muscle memory from a different life, from operating theaters that weren't hospitals and didn't exist on any map. Her fingers moved with the efficiency of hands that had sutured arterial bleeds with nothing but a headlamp and morphine tabs. Here, she was careful to move slowly, to seem uncertain, to keep her competence just below the threshold where anyone would notice. Just a nurse. That was the story. The stretcher came through the ambulance bay at 3:52 a.m. A 27-year-old paratrooper named Marcus Webb, shrapnel wounds to his right shoulder and upper back, conscious and cursing steadily with the creative vulgarity of someone trained by the 75th Ranger Regiment. Natalie heard the paramedic radio transmission before he even arrived. 27-year-old male, GSW, no, shrapnel, approximately 14 minutes ago, military bearing, conscious and alert, vital stable. She was already moving toward Trauma Bay 3 before the stretcher wheel squeaked across the tile floor. That was her assignment tonight. That was her job. The thing she didn't expect was the scar. When she cut away his shirt, she saw it immediately. The surgical scar on his right shoulder, distinctive and precise, the kind of stitching pattern that came from field surgery, from someone who'd worked fast and clean under impossible conditions. She'd sewn that pattern exactly once in her life, 20 years ago, on a 7-year-old Afghan boy caught in crossfire near Sangin, bleeding out faster than her 4 lines could replace blood volume. She remembered his name. She remembered his mother's face. She remembered the way his shoulder bled copper-colored in the chemical light of a portable med kit. She remembered stitching him with hands that didn't shake, because shaking would have killed him, because she was Major Natalie Hayes then, and that's what Major Natalie Hayes did. She saved people. She held them together when the world was trying to rip them apart. Marcus Webb, 17 years older than she'd last seen him, pulled from a 7-year-old's memory into an adult man's body, was looking at her with suddenly focused eyes. Recognition flickered there. Something in her face, something in the way her hands moved, had triggered a pattern he recognized from his own classified files. She saw him seeing it. She saw the instant calculation begin behind his eyes, the same calculation that had gotten him through Ranger selection and 3 combat deployments. Natalie steadied her breathing. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. She'd learned to weaponize restraint years ago. She examined the shrapnel wounds with professional distance, her fingers pressing around the lacerations with the systematic precision of someone assessing tissue damage and infection risk. The wounds were clean, modern shrapnel, not fragmented metal. They go through, not stay embedded. She could work with this. She could work with anything. Tetanus current, she asked the paramedic, her voice steady and soft. Booster 2 years ago, Webb answered instead, his eyes still tracking her, his voice the kind of gravel that comes from screaming in pain without breaking. I know what I'm looking at. She didn't respond. Didn't acknowledge the implication. She just worked. measured the depth of the wounds, called out numbers to the resident who was still loading the vitals into the system. Approximately 2.3 centimeters penetration on the lateral aspect, clean edges, no active bleeding for the last 6 minutes. Her hands moved like a surgeon's hands because they were a surgeon's hands. She'd just spent the last 2 decades learning to make them look like a nurse's hands. The difference was muscle memory. The difference was that she could do this in the dark with one hand. That was when Dr. Ashford walked in. She heard his shoes first, expensive leather, Italian, the kind that cost more than her monthly rent. Click, click, click on the linoleum. His presence seemed to displace the air pressure in the trauma bay, the way certain people carry authority like a weapon. He was 48, Yale Medical School by the plaque in his office, connected to Philadelphia's wealthier families through 3 different country clubs and a marriage to a federal judge's daughter. He'd been chief of emergency medicine at Sacred Heart for 6 years, and in that time, he'd cultivated a reputation for precision that masked a deeper taste for control. Natalie recognized the type immediately. She'd encountered them in every military bureaucracy she'd ever been forced to navigate. Ashford moved to the bedside with the casual confidence of someone who'd never been questioned. His eyes swept across Webb's wounds, across the monitor readout, across Natalie's hands, then settled on the medical chart she'd begun filling out. It was a practiced scan, the visual efficiency of someone who'd attended to thousands of patients. Then he saw it. His gaze caught on a single line, the unit designation on Webb's patient history. 75th Ranger Regiment. But not just that. The specific battalion. The specific deployment date. The specific operation designation that appeared in Webb's medical records as a classified combat injury. Natalie watched Ashford's face change. Not visibly. Not obviously. But she'd been trained to read micro-expressions the way other people read books, and she saw the instant when calculation replaced routine. She saw the moment when a doctor's clinical detachment became something colder. His eyes flicked to her hands, then to her face, then back to the chart. He was connecting patterns. He was recognizing the mathematical impossibility of coincidence. A paratrooper from a classified operation. A nurse with shrapnel scarring and the kind of surgical knowledge that only came from a specific place, a specific time, a specific classified operation. "I'll take it from here," Ashford said, his voice smooth as polished steel. Not a request. A command structured to sound like courtesy. "Nurse Hayes, you can chart the initial assessment and then move on to Bay 1. We have a chest pain complaint that needs an EKG." Natalie nodded, stepping back with the obedience of someone used to being dismissed. She moved toward the curtain, her shoulders slightly hunched, her posture submissive, the physical language of someone who'd learned to take up less space. She didn't look back at Ashford. She didn't need to. She could feel his gaze tracking her exit, could sense him filing away observations, connecting dots that had been carefully kept separate for 20 years. His expression had hardened into something she recognized from every bureaucratic confrontation she'd ever survived. It was the look of a man who'd discovered leverage. It was the look of someone realizing that he held a secret, and secrets at this scale could be converted into power. The Bay 1 patient was indeed a chest pain complaint, a 53-year-old accountant with probable angina, and Natalie placed the EKG leads with practiced efficiency while her mind remained in the surgical bay behind her, where Marcus Webb was being examined by Dr. Ashford, where her past was intersecting with her present, where the careful architecture of her hidden life had just developed a hairline fracture. She'd spent 2 decades building her existence around the principle that no one could connect her to Sangin, no one could link the nurse in Philadelphia to the major who'd testified against trafficking networks connected to Fort Bragg contractors, no one could cross-reference a classified operation with a woman who was legally dead on federal paperwork. But Ashford had just done it in the space of a heartbeat. And now he was processing the implications of what he'd learned. The fluorescent lights hummed their insect frequency hum. The monitor beeped its steady rhythm. And somewhere in the back of Natalie's mind, trained by 20 years of military service to anticipate threats before they materialized, she understood that something fundamental had shifted. Dr. Ashford had seen something he wasn't supposed to see. And he would spend the next 72 hours deciding what to do with that knowledge. The next voice she heard was Webb's, muffled through the curtain but still audible. "I know her. From before." "I know," and then the sound of Ashford's authoritative interruption, cutting him off before he could finish the sentence that would have confirmed everything Ashford already suspected. The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then the monitor alarm chimed on her chest pain patient, the EKG showing concerning ST elevation, and Natalie's training took over. She called for the resident. She initiated the chest pain protocol. She did what she'd always done, she saved the person in front of her while everything else burned in the background. But her hands, for just an instant before she moved to action, trembled not from fear but from the certainty of what was coming. The truth had just entered Sacred Heart's emergency department, and Dr. Ashford was already deciding how to weaponize it. The board was white. Magnetic. Mounted on the wall outside the nursing station where everyone passed at shift change. That's what made it perfect. Natalie saw her name at 6:19 a.m., printed in Ashford's meticulous block letters, Nurse Hayes, improper patient familiarity, under review. Typed. Laminated. Permanent. A yellow sticky note flagged it, "See me immediately." She didn't stop walking. Didn't let her eyes linger more than a second. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed like they always did, indifferent to humiliation. Around her, nurses paused mid-conversation, eyes sliding toward the board, then toward her. The whispers started before she reached the break room, soft, deliberate hisses designed to carry. "Did you see? Patient familiarity. That's actually. I heard she was in his room for like 20 minutes straight." Natalie poured coffee into a ceramic mug that had been in the department since 2004. Her hand was steady. The kind of steady that came from holding pressure on abdominal wounds while helicopters landed. The kind of steady that didn't advertise what was happening underneath. Muscle memory. The body's way of lying when the mind needed to survive. She carried her tray to the central table where she'd eaten lunch for the past 3 years. Sat down. Unwrapped a turkey sandwich from a plastic container. Around her, the break room continued its rhythm, people standing, people sitting, the microwave humming its 3-beat countdown. For exactly 45 seconds, the room maintained its shape. Then Sarah Chen, who'd asked Natalie for wound dressing advice just last week, remembered an urgent chart review. Marcus Webb's cousin, who worked in respiratory, suddenly received a text that required him to leave immediately. Jenny Park, who'd covered Natalie's shift twice, stood up slowly and walked toward the door without meeting her eyes. The charge nurse, Patricia, who'd brought Natalie homemade soup after a 12-hour trauma rotation, passed behind her chair and didn't say anything at all. Within 90 seconds, Natalie sat alone at a table for 8. The sandwich tasted like nothing. Paper texture. She chewed anyway. Swallowed. Chewed again. Around her, the empty room was louder than it had ever been. The refrigerator hummed. The ice machine kicked on. Someone's phone buzzed in a locker. These were the sounds of a break room that had decided you didn't exist anymore. The sounds of a hospital deciding your presence was a mistake. She was finishing her coffee when Ashford appeared in the doorway. He didn't knock. Didn't ask if they could talk privately. He simply stood there in his white coat with the hospital logo embroidered in blue thread, his stethoscope draped like a trophy, and said loudly enough for anyone listening in the hallway to hear, a Nurse Hayes. "My office." 5 minutes. Natalie stood. Rinsed her mug. Dried it carefully on a paper towel. Took her time. His office was on the 3rd floor. Large window overlooking the Philadelphia skyline. A diploma from University of Pennsylvania mounted on the wall, class of 1998. Framed photos of Ashford at a gala, Ashford at a medical conference, Ashford receiving some kind of award. No family photos. No pictures of him actually helping anyone. When she entered, Marcus Webb's mother was already sitting in the visitor's chair. Natalie's body didn't tense. Didn't miss a beat. She'd been briefed on operations with minutes' notice while rounds of ammunition impact-tested sandbags around her. A surprise audience was information, nothing more. Mrs. Webb. Natalie nodded. I hope Marcus is recovering well. The woman didn't respond. She was watching Ashford, waiting. Nurse Hayes, I need to be direct. Ashford's voice carried that theatrical concern, the kind used in hospital board meetings and deposition recordings. Your level of involvement with Mr. Webb has crossed a professional boundary. 20 minutes in his room yesterday. Hands-on involvement in his care when other nurses were available. The way you looked at his chart. He paused. The silence was a weapon. I'm reassigning you to permanent night shift, effective immediately. Your attachment to certain patients demonstrates a concerning pattern. We have protocols for good reason. He turned to Mrs. Webb with something that might have been sympathy if it had been genuine. I apologize that you've witnessed this emotional entanglement. We maintain strict standards to ensure our staff treats all patients with appropriate distance. Natalie took one measured breath. The tear that escaped wasn't from fear. Wasn't from shame. It was the kind of tear that comes from understanding, with perfect clarity, that you are watching someone dismantle your life in the way that comfortable men do, with bureaucratic precision, with witnesses, with the absolute certainty that nothing you say will matter. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact. When she spoke, her voice had dropped half an octave. I've been dismissed by better men than you, Doctor. And I'm still here. Mrs. Webb's eyes widened slightly. Ashford's jaw tightened. He hadn't expected her to speak at all. That was his mistake. Night shift, he repeated coldly. Effective now. You'll work 2,100 to 800 hours, starting today. Natalie left without acknowledging the dismissal. Didn't bow. Didn't apologize. Didn't offer excuses. She simply turned and walked out of his office with the same posture she'd maintained while enemy fire hammered the clinic walls in Sangin, present, vertical, and refusing to give them the satisfaction of watching her break. The second day was worse because it was systematic. She arrived for the night shift and found her name missing from the main patient assignment. She'd been posted at Station 4, the farthest point from the nurse's hub, positioned so that she couldn't observe the central monitors without moving 15 feet. Her regular patients, the ones she'd built relationships with over 3 years, had been reassigned to other nurses. A diabetic woman she'd been managing for 2 years. A post-operative cardiac patient she'd monitored through his worst night. An elderly man with COPD whose daughter specifically asked for Natalie's care. All reassigned. She inventoried medications instead. Counted for bags. Logged equipment. Performed the tasks that kept the department functioning but required no expertise. Nurse work instead of nursing. Work that could be done by anyone, which meant work that proved you were anyone. Around 11 p.m., she was restocking supplies in the back corridor when voices carried through the medication room wall, Ashford's voice and someone else. The hospital administrator. Frank Colson. A man who wore suits that cost more than her monthly rent and moved through Sacred Heart like he owned every corridor. Her background shows significant employment gaps, Ashford was saying. His voice had that performative concern again. 20 years unaccounted for. Military timeframes, based on the periods in question. Natalie's hands stopped moving. If she accessed classified information through that patient chart, if she's connecting what happened in Sangin to current operations, we have a liability issue that goes beyond patient care. The administrator's response was quieter. Measured. Can we move her? Working on a lateral transfer to psychiatric. Graveyard shift, night supervision only. She'd have no contact with acute trauma cases. That should resolve the classification concerns. The door to the medication room was 3 feet away. Natalie could have stepped inside. Could have confronted him. Could have demanded to know what he thought he understood about Sangin, about Webb, about any of it. Instead, she returned to her supply cart and continued counting. The realization was colder than adrenaline. This wasn't punishment for insubordination. This wasn't an ego-driven attack by a small man. This was calculated protection of something. Something connected to Webb. Something connected to the unit designation that appeared on a chart that shouldn't have been accessible. Ashford was using hospital protocols as a scalpel, carving her out of proximity to information, creating distance between her and the one patient who might explain why she recognized his scar tissue, why her hands had moved on muscle memory during his examination. She finished her shift at 0800 and drove home through early morning traffic on I-76, her eyes fixed on the brake lights ahead, her hand steady on a steering wheel that felt like it belonged to a stranger. That's when everything began to accelerate in ways she couldn't yet see. Webb crashed on the second night of her exile. She heard about it through the nursing grapevine, the whispered conversations that happened when they thought she couldn't hear. His oxygen saturation had dropped during the evening shift. His abdomen had become distended. Signs of internal bleeding. Classic presentation of a missed complication, the kind of thing you caught if you actually looked at your patients. But that wasn't the worst part. Ashford had been in the hospital that night. Late. Staying past his shift. He'd reviewed Webb's labs himself and told the night resident, a first-year doctor named Chen who was terrified of authority, post-operative gas. Expected after abdominal surgery. No intervention required. Do not call for escalation. Natalie was in the department for supply inventory when she overheard the night shift report. Her name was already being removed from Webb's care team. Ashford had posted it on the board, Nurse Hayes restricted from Trauma Bay 2. Dr. Ashford primary oversight. She didn't need to see the monitors to understand what was happening. The timeline was too neat. The reassignment too convenient. A patient crashing after being deliberately denied escalation protocols, and a nurse removed from proximity to notice any of it. He was letting Webb die on purpose. Not to harm the young soldier. To justify removing Natalie from the department before she could piece together what his presence in Sangin meant. Before she could connect a classified unit designation to classified decisions being made now. I need some jello, she thought automatically. The dark humor of someone who'd seen worse. Who'd made jokes in IED craters because crying wouldn't stop the bleeding. Except this time, the jello wouldn't help. This time, the game had shifted from social humiliation to something with real consequences. Webb was in a hospital bed with a doctor actively ensuring he wouldn't survive the night, and Natalie was 6 floors away, counting supplies. She set down the clipboard she was holding. Walked to the elevator. Pressed the button for the 2nd floor. And made a choice that would change everything. The next 48 hours were surgical. Ashford didn't shout or gesture. He simply rewrote the schedule. Natalie arrived for her shift on Thursday evening to find her patient load empty, 14 names vanished, redistributed to nurses with seniority and connections she didn't possess. She said nothing. She clocked in, checked the board again, and moved to the supply closet to restock trauma kits that wouldn't be used by her hands. Her composure was a weapon she kept razor sharp. The fluorescent lights cast everything in that particular shade of institutional white that made the world feel smaller, colder, less forgiving than it actually was. By Friday morning, Ashford had moved her to the midnight to 8 shift. He announced it casually during rounds, his voice smooth as silk, night rotation will suit you better, I think. Fewer distractions. More time to focus on your documentation. The timing was precise, it isolated her completely. The attending physicians worked days. The respiratory therapists ran mostly days. The pharmacists who could advocate for her, the charge nurses who understood the floor's rhythm, they all vanished at 1900 hours. She would work in the ghost hours when the hospital became a different creature, skeletal and quiet, with only residents who feared Ashford, travelers who'd be gone in weeks, and nursing students who didn't know her name yet. It was a brilliant move. Strategic. The kind of dismantling that looked like preference rather than punishment. Natalie folded her old schedule into thirds and placed it in her locker without comment. She'd been separated from units before. Isolated before. The silence was familiar. It was something she knew how to survive. But that wasn't the worst part. The real sabotage was happening in the hallways where she didn't work, in offices where her name sat in folders marked confidential. On Friday evening, while Natalie prepared medications in the empty pharmacy section of night shift, Ashford was on the phone with a member of the hospital board. His voice, she would later learn, had been concerned and clinical, the voice of a man protecting an institution from liability. "I have significant concerns regarding her employment history," he'd said. "Multiple gaps. Unexplained absences spanning entire years. No references I can verify. When I attempted to review her prior employment records, they appear to have been sealed." The board member had asked the obvious question, why was she hired with sealed records? Ashford's response was pure genius. "That's precisely what troubles me. It suggests either government involvement or something worse." He'd made 3 phone calls that night. 3 separate board members. By the time Natalie was finishing her first midnight shift, the uncertainty had been planted like a seed in fertile soil. They didn't know what she was hiding. That was the beauty of it. Not knowing made her a threat. Saturday passed in the quiet routine of night shift, a fall, an abdominal pain that resolved itself, an elderly man with pneumonia who needed frequent vitals. The work was good work, necessary work, but it was work that no one would see. No one would remember. No one would use to build a case for her value. Ashford knew this too. He'd chosen night shift not just to isolate her from allies, but to erase her. When you worked in the dark, you stopped existing in the daylight world where reputations lived. At 03 for 7 hours on Sunday morning, the monitor alarm screamed. Bed 7. Webb. His monitor was a sound like a dentist's drill cutting through bone, urgent and violating in the profound silence of the night shift floor. Natalie was 3 beds away restocking a crash cart when the alarm split the air. Her body moved before her mind caught up, 12 years of response drills, of mortar attacks triggering automatic reactions, her legs already carrying her toward the sound. The monitor showed chaos. Blood pressure 62/38 and dropping. Heart rate 140, tachycardic, desperate. O2 sat holding steady, but that didn't matter because his pressure was catastrophic and dropping with each beat. Webb's face was grey. His neck veins were distending like ropes being pulled tight beneath his skin. His trachea was deviating. The classic triad of tension pneumothorax, his chest was filling with air that had nowhere to go, collapsing his lung, crushing his heart, suffocating him from the inside out. The night resident, a kid named Torres who looked like he'd been awake for 36 hours straight, was frozen at the bedside. The night nurse was gone, somewhere down on the medical floor handling a code that had pulled everyone away except Natalie. The code team was 7 floors down and would take minutes to respond. Minutes he didn't have. Ashford emerged from the on-call room like he'd been waiting for this. His eyes were cold. Clinical. He positioned himself in the doorway, blocking the path between Natalie and Webb's bed. "Step back, Nurse Hayes," he said. His voice was a tool, precise and perfect. "You're not assigned to this patient. We have protocols." Webb's lips were starting to turn blue. His oxygen saturation was still reading 92% on paper, but his color said something else entirely. He was suffocating. He was dying in bed 7 while a man in a white coat protected his territory. "Move," Natalie said. One word. Her voice had changed. It had dropped an octave, lost its careful politeness, found something else underneath, something that had been waiting in the background like a weapon on a rack. It was the voice she'd used in Sangin when a young boy bled out in her hands and she'd had to tell his mother. It was command voice. Ashford didn't move. He smiled. He actually smiled. "You're not in charge here." She pushed past him. Not roughly. Not with anger. With the kind of calm efficiency that bypassed argument entirely. She was at Webb's bedside in 3 strides, her hands already moving, her eyes reading the monitor like a language she'd learned decades ago. Tension pneumothorax. Missed by the resident because it can look like a lot of things, because people miss things when they're tired, when they're scared, when they don't know what they're looking at. but Natalie had seen 17-year-old boys with tension pneumothorax. She'd seen it in a compound in Sangin with mortar fire walking toward them like thunder. She knew the look. "Get out of my way, doctor," she said. Not a request. It was what you said to soldiers blocking a corridor. It was what you said when people's lives depended on obedience. She ripped open an MRE packet from her jacket pocket. She always carried them, a habit from deployment, from places where you never knew when you'd have access to supplies, and tore the plastic emergency heating element. The plastic was sharp against her palms. Her hands were moving with the muscle memory of someone who'd performed this in the dark, in the rain, in the wreckage of buildings with the sound of gunfire outside. She grabbed a 14-gauge needle from the crash cart. The largest bore needle they had. The needle that looked like it belonged in a gun range, not a hospital. 14-gauge angiocath, she said to no one, to Torres, to the universe. Her hands were steady. Steady in a way that commanded respect from the body, that made fear irrelevant. She prepped the skin with an alcohol swab. She didn't have time for proper sterile technique and she knew it, and positioned the needle at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. The anatomical sweet spot. The place where trapped air lived and where needles went to save lives. She pushed in. The resistance of muscle and rib and pleura. Then the hiss. The beautiful, terrible hiss of air escaping. The pressurized air that had been crushing Webb's lung, his heart, his life, releasing into the atmosphere of an ICU room at 03 for 9 hours on a Sunday morning. The monitor tone shifted. The pressure that had been dropping, suddenly stabilized. 70/45. 75/48. Climbing. His oxygen saturation stayed steady. His color started coming back. The blue around his lips began to fade like someone was turning up the saturation on a photograph. Webb's eyes opened. He gasped. Real oxygen. Real blood. Real survival. The night resident stared at her. His mouth was open. His hands were shaking. How did you? Chest seal from an MRE packet, she said quietly. 14-gauge needle. Protocol is the same whether you're in a hospital or a war zone. The body doesn't change. Her hands were shaking now. The adrenaline crash hitting like a wall, the surge of combat chemicals leaving her bloodstream and leaving behind tremor and cold and the weight of having just turned death into a detour. But her voice was steady. Her posture was upright. She looked at Ashford standing in the doorway and watched his face process what he'd just witnessed, a nurse performing emergency decompression with the confidence of someone who'd done it under fire, a nurse whose hands moved like someone who'd held lives together in the wreckage of things. His eyes narrowed. She saw him reach for his phone. Saw him photograph her MRE packet. Saw him photographing her hands. Saw him taking notes. Building his case. She'd saved the patient. And now she was being documented as a threat. "My office," Ashford said. His voice had lost something. The smooth certainty was cracked. First thing at shift change. But he didn't go anywhere. He stood in the doorway taking photographs of her bag while she finished stabilizing Webb, while Torres called the attending, while the night shift floor suddenly came alive with purpose and urgency and the sound of a young soldier being given back his life. The code team was 7 floors up in the surgical ICU, managing a massive MI, which meant the main floor ICU had exactly 1 attending on call, and that attending was Dr. Ashford, who'd spent the last 40 minutes at the nurse's station reviewing charts with the kind of focused attention he reserved for finding ways to destroy people. Webb's monitor began its soft escalation at 03 for 7 hours. Oxygen saturation first, 91, then 89, then 87. His breathing shallow. His chest moving wrong, like something inside had decided to collapse. The alarms sang their algorithmic song, and Natalie was moving before the first beep finished, muscle memory overriding the exhaustion that had been hollowing her out for 3 days. She was at his bedside in 2.3 seconds, hands already assessing, fingers finding the point where breath had stopped being breath and started being struggle. Tension pneumothorax. The air was in his chest cavity, compressing his lung, pushing his heart sideways, and the code team was nowhere. The intercom crackled. They had 13 minutes minimum. Ashford appeared in the doorway like a shadow finding its shape. He watched. He did not move. He did not call anyone. He stood there with his phone already recording. Natalie's hands were steady as a surgical laser. She couldn't think about that. Couldn't think about anything except the fact that this man, this kid, really, just a kid who'd survived Sangin twice, was about to die if she waited for the protocol that would take 13 minutes. The crash cart was 6 feet away. She moved, and the world compressed into the immediate and the necessary. 14-gauge angiocath needle. She'd improvised with less in field hospitals that smelled like diesel and death. Here she had fluorescent lights and actual sterile supplies, which felt like luxury. The needle went in at the second intercostal space, midclavicular line, the textbook location, the one they taught in courses attended by people who'd never had to do this while incoming fire was raking the building. The hiss came, that specific sound of trapped air escaping, the universe exhaling. O2 saturation climbed, 87, 91, 94. Webb's breathing eased. His color shifted from ash to almost human. Behind her, Ashford stood in the doorway taking photographs with the focused intensity of a man documenting evidence. Torres arrived, then another nurse, then the night shift charge nurse, and the room filled with the organized chaos of people who knew what they were doing. The code team called down, they'd heard over the radio. Ashford was already gone by the time they entered, already back at his station, already composing narratives in his head about what he'd witnessed. What he documented. What he could prove. Natalie finished her paperwork at 0612 hours, her hand steady on the keyboard, her mind already 3 moves ahead in a game she hadn't chosen to play. Webb slept. His oxygen was 98. His heart rhythm steady on the monitor like a metronome keeping time for someone who'd almost run out. She could leave now. She should leave. Instead, she went to the break room and sat in the chair by the window where the first light was starting to crack Philadelphia's skyline like an egg, and she thought about the 7-year-old boy in Sangin whose chest she'd packed with gauze while his sister held his hand, and she thought about how some debts never finish paying, and she thought about a man with narrowed eyes who'd just watched her break every rule he'd been accumulating like ammunition. That evening came with a weight of inevitability. The ICU was quiet, that particular quiet of a trauma floor between crises, the lull before the next storm. Natalie was documenting Webb's recovery, her fingers moving through the electronic chart with the muscle memory of someone who'd done this 10,000 times, when she heard the elevator doors open with that soft mechanical sigh. The man who emerged didn't belong. That was the first thing she knew. Not the gun, the composure told her before the gun did. A man in his late 30s, early 40s maybe, dressed in a jacket that hung wrong because of what it was concealing. Dead eyes. Not angry. Not yet. The kind of eyes that had seen things that killed the part of you that could still be shocked. His hands were moving wrong, shaking just slightly, the tremor of someone running on adrenaline and rage and the specific gravity of a soldier who'd lost someone. He was signing in as a unit brother, which meant he knew Webb, which meant he'd probably already heard the story, the code, the 2 cardiac arrests, the doctor who'd frozen while a nurse brought a kid back from the edge. Where is he? The man's voice wasn't loud yet, just pointed. The doctor who let Marcus die. Where is he right now? The nurse's station had maybe 6 people. All of them suddenly very interested in their computers. The desk phone was ringing. Nobody answered it. Natalie could measure the timeline in her head. Security was on the 4th floor. 60 seconds, maybe 75 if they weren't paying attention. The man's jacket shifted. She could see the shape now, the bulge of a concealed carry, probably 9mm, probably loaded, absolutely certainly ready. His hand was moving toward it with the kind of slow-motion inevitability that meant he'd made a decision somewhere in the last hour and he was committed to seeing it through. Dr. Ashford was at the nurse's station. Of course he was. Of course the universe was this precise and this cruel. He was reviewing charts, reviewing his documentation, reviewing the photographs he'd taken of her breaking protocol, and he had no idea that the man walking toward him had come to execute a vengeance that had nothing to do with hospital politics and everything to do with a soldier's code that said you protected the people who protected you. The moment stretched. Natalie could see it the way she'd seen things in Sangin, the way the world separated into foreground and background, into what mattered and what didn't. The gun coming out. Ashford not seeing it. The elevator doors closing behind a man with dead eyes who'd decided that Marcus Webb's suffering required a payment in blood. She moved. Not fast, there was no fast that would work here. Just direct. Just clear. Just stepping between Ashford and the trajectory of what was coming the way you'd step between a child and a falling object. The man's hand was fully on the weapon now. His eyes focused on her for the first time, and she saw him calculate whether this thin woman in scrubs with a surgical drain visible at her collarbone was worth the angle change. She saw him decide she wasn't. She saw his finger tighten on the trigger. The first shot came like a physical argument. Center mass, her upper right chest, the impact like being hit with a sledgehammer wrapped in fire. Pain was data. Pain was information. Pain meant still alive. The second shot followed half a second later, lower, through the abdomen, and she felt something tear that was important, felt the specific sensation of blood that was hers, moving where it shouldn't be moving. The third shot came from a different angle because she was falling, because her body was no longer a target but a falling object, and it caught her in the left lower abdomen on the way down. She hit the linoleum with her palms out in a move she hadn't made consciously, muscle memory from basic training overriding the signals her nervous system was sending about blood loss and organ damage. Webb screamed. She heard that clearly. Heard the security guards hitting the stairwell, heard the radio static, heard a woman's voice calling overhead, shooting, shooting, third floor ICU. Heard the man's footsteps as he moved to finish what he'd started with Ashford, heard the moment security decided to be fast instead of cautious, heard the sound of a body hitting tile hard enough to suggest broken ribs. She kept her eyes open. That was something. That was a choice. That was staying in the fight even when the fight had become something you couldn't stand up and meet. Ashford was staring at her. His eyes were doing calculations. His mind was already working through the liability scenarios, the insurance claims, the way this moment could be repositioned in the narrative he'd been constructing. She woke in recovery with her chest wrapped tight and tubes running from places that shouldn't have tubes. 18 hours had passed. The trauma surgeons had opened her up, had moved things around, had put her back together with the kind of competent efficiency that felt like betrayal when she woke to find that the surgery had only improved her capacity for suffering. Ashford was standing over her bedside. He was holding papers. His voice was clinically polite, the tone of a doctor discussing a patient's prognosis. Your heroics don't excuse your insubordination, Major. He said the rank like a slur. Your unauthorized procedures, your emotional instability, your questionable background. Sacred Heart can't afford the liability. Given the federal investigation that's about to begin into unauthorized weapons discharge on hospital grounds, we need to distance ourselves from personnel with classified histories. He placed the termination papers on her bedside table next to the clear plastic bag containing her bloodstained scrubs. Effective immediately. You'll be contacted by HR regarding severance and your final paycheck. I recommend you discuss this with a lawyer. Not here. Elsewhere. He left. The room was quiet except for the ventilators and the monitors and the sound of a woman whose body was put back together but whose world had just been taken apart with the precision of someone who'd spent decades learning how to dismantle things. On day 3, when she could stand for more than 90 seconds without the world rotating, she went to the basement laundry room of the hospital that no longer wanted her. The attendant, a woman named Lucia who'd always smiled, wouldn't look at her directly. Natalie held her blood-stained scrubs. She'd worn them for 17 years. She'd saved people in these scrubs. She'd held dying people in these scrubs. She'd stepped between a man with a gun and a colleague she despised in these scrubs. The blood was dark now, old, the stain spreading across the front like a map of something she couldn't change. She put them in the industrial washer with shaking hands. She added the soap. She set the temperature to hot. She turned the dial and listened to the machine engage, listened to the water begin its work of erasure, and she understood that this was the final indignity. Not the bullets. Not the surgery. Not the termination papers. This quiet dissolution. This return to nothing. 3 days. That's how long the bloodstain stayed on her scrubs before she could stand long enough to walk them to the hospital laundry. The fabric was stiff. Rust-colored. Her hands shook as she folded them, not from pain, though her ribs screamed with every breath, but from the weight of finality. These scrubs had held her through field surgery in Sangin, through 18 years at Sacred Heart, through 48 hours of Dr. Ashford's methodical destruction. Now they were just fabric. Evidence. A ghost of someone who'd been erased so completely that even the blood belonged to a name that legally didn't exist. She pressed them into the laundry bin at 0623 hours on a Tuesday morning. The hospital was quiet. Night shift was ending. Early shift staff moved through corridors in their fresh uniforms, unburdened by history. The fluorescent lights cast everything in pale green. Nobody looked at her. Nobody ever did. That was the point. Erasure meant invisibility. Invisibility meant survival. She'd learned that lesson 20 years ago in Sangin Valley when the Pentagon made her legally dead. She could learn it again. The elevator doors slid open on the ground floor lobby at 0641 hours, and everything changed. Her 17-year-old son Ethan burst through the main entrance carrying a wooden shadow box like it was made of uranium. His backpack was slung sideways. His expression was the look of a kid who'd driven 90 minutes in rush-hour traffic on pure adrenaline. Behind him came Webb, limping on a surgical knee with the determined set of someone who had no intention of staying seated. And behind Webb came others. Men in civilian clothes with the unmistakable bearing of people who'd stood in formation at 0500 hours. Men whose eyes held the particular calm that only comes from having survived artillery. Men whose presence made the air pressure change. Mom. Ethan's voice cut through the lobby like a command. They need to see these. The shadow box opened. Medals caught the morning light. Silver. Bronze. Purple. The kind of decorations that don't appear in hospital personnel files because those files were supposed to never exist. Webb stood from his wheelchair, not with the careful movement of someone recovering from internal bleeding and emergency surgery, but with the parade ground precision of a soldier stepping into formation. His voice dropped into the register of someone addressing a room full of junior enlisted. That's Major Natalie Hayes, them. The word major hung in the lobby like a detonation. Heads turned. A trembling surgical nurse, the same one who'd watched Natalie perform emergency needle decompression while Ashford stood paralyzed, picked up the computer tablet showing Natalie's hospital file. Her hands moved across the screen, her voice wavering as she read aloud. Silver Star. Bronze Star with Valor. Purple Heart. Another Purple Heart. An A. The nurse paused. Her eyes widened. Navy Cross citation. A grizzled man in the back of the assembled crowd removed his baseball cap. The motion was careful. Reverent. When he raised his hand, a Navy SEAL trident was tattooed across his scalp in faded ink, the kind of marking that meant something survived when the flesh it lived on had nearly been destroyed. His voice was gravel. Measured. The major earned those in Sangin, pulling 15 operators and 43 civilians out of a compound under sustained fire for 11 hours straight. 15. 43. 11. The numbers sat in the air like they had weight. More voices emerged from the crowd. I was there. I was in her team. She saved my life in that compound. They came from construction workers, from men driving taxis, from men sitting in office parks staring at spreadsheets while the weight of Sangin never quite lifted. There were 150 of them by 0708 hours. Natalie counted. She always counted. It was what you did when you'd learned to track casualty percentages in the dark. The sliding doors at the lobby entrance opened again. An FBI agent in a charcoal suit stepped through, flanked by 2 colleagues. The agent's eyes were the color of winter concrete. Professional. Unmoved by the shadow of medals or the assembly of veterans. She produced a badge and let it settle against her jacket long enough for everyone to process the implication. Major Natalie Hayes was placed in federal witness protection 20 years ago after providing testimony against a military contracting network. The agent's voice was formal, carrying the particular weight of someone stating facts that had already destroyed lives. Weapons. Intelligence. Medical supply chains in Afghanistan. Her records were sealed under federal statute. She was ordered to disappear. Ashford emerged from the administrative hallway at 0712 hours. His suit was expensive. His shoes were polished. His face was the color of someone who'd just watched a building he designed collapse into its own foundation. 17 people went to federal prison because of Major Hayes' testimony, the agent continued. $400 million in illicit operations disrupted. The contracting network lost everything. She turned. Her eyes locked onto Ashford with the precision of a targeting system. 3 days ago, someone accessed sealed federal databases using Sacred Heart's administrative credentials. Someone ran an unauthorized background check on protected witness records. Ashford's mouth opened. Nothing emerged. That's a felony, the agent said. 20 years per count. 15 counts so far. The silence was so thick you could operate in it. The kind of silence that only happens when someone realizes they've already lost but hasn't yet acknowledged it. We reviewed your computer access logs, the agent continued. Her colleague produced a folder. Documents. Timestamps. Your phone records. Your attempt to falsify hospital disciplinary records to justify terminating Major Hayes before she could connect her patient's unit designation to a trafficking network currently under renewed investigation. Ashford's face shifted through colors like a degrading photograph. Red. White. Gray. The expensive suit suddenly looked like a costume. The polished shoes looked like a child's imitation of authority. Dr. Ashford, you're under arrest for unauthorized access to classified federal databases, obstruction of a federal investigation, and falsifying medical records to cover the breach. The cuffs went on at 0714 hours. They were stainless steel. They caught the light the same way the medals in Ethan's shadow box had caught the light. He was walked past Natalie. Their eyes met for exactly 2 seconds. She didn't blink. She didn't flinch. She didn't do anything except meet the gaze with the same quiet dignity that had carried her through 18 years of erasure. One measured breath. That was all. He looked away first. The 150 veterans moved without instruction. They surrounded Natalie in a protective circle, a formation so practiced and instinctive that it looked less like a choice and more like gravity reasserting itself. Webb put a hand on her shoulder. Someone else brought her a chair. Someone else called her Major, and the word sounded like a prayer. 6 months later, Natalie Hayes walked through Sacred Heart's main entrance wearing the white coat of Director of Emergency Medicine. The faded Special Forces patch was now openly displayed on her collar alongside her nursing credentials, visible under the fluorescent lights that had once lit her erasure. The patch was old. Worn. Faded from 20 years in a dark attic. It was also the most powerful thing hanging in that hospital. The emergency department was different now. New trauma protocols. Veteran liaison programs. Training modules she developed from muscle memory and 11 hours under fire. The surgical nurse who'd read her decorations aloud was now her deputy director. Webb worked 3 days a week as a veterans advocate, checking in on combat casualties with PTSD, making sure nobody fell through the cracks the way the system had nearly broken Natalie through. At shift change on a Thursday afternoon, she saw Ashford at the employee entrance. Navy security uniform. Pressed but lifeless. He was scanning employee badges with the mechanical efficiency of someone performing penance. His medical license was suspended pending criminal trial. The charges had expanded. the federal investigators had found 32 instances of unauthorized database access, most of them running background checks on nurses and orderlies with military histories. He was building something. A file. A network. Something that went deeper than one dismissed major. Natalie didn't gloat. Didn't speak. Didn't acknowledge him at all. She just walked past with the same quiet composure that had carried her through every public humiliation. On her office wall hung Ethan's shadow box. Beneath it, a plaque read, "Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns." Webb stopped by her office that evening with coffee and news. "The contractors you testified against in Sangin, the FBI says your patient's unit identification broke open their new investigation. For more arrests this month. One of them is a judge." She nodded. Touched the patch on her collar. The weight of it. The realness of it. After 20 years of being erased, of being invisible, of being nothing, she was finally visible to the people who mattered. The ones who'd stood beside her. The ones who'd come back. Her son Ethan volunteered in the ER on weekends, filing charts alongside nurses who now treated his mother with the respect owed to someone who'd taken 3 bullets and survived. Someone who'd earned valor. Someone who'd refused to disappear. That's the thing about systems built on lies. They eventually collapse under the weight of truth. And truth has witnesses willing to testify. Truth has 150 veterans who'll stand in a lobby. Truth has a 17-year-old kid carrying his mother's medals in a wooden shadow box because some erasures don't hold. If you've ever been underestimated by someone in power who didn't know your true value, hit that subscribe button and share this story. Like if you believe justice should catch up to those who abuse their authority. And comment below, would you have stood in that lobby, or would you have walked away?